As I'm recording this critical thought, the Callisto Protocol had its final and official bit of DLC, wrapping up the story, wrapping up any kind of bonus challenges, and all that. And it's once again reignited this discussion as to whether or not the game was even good to begin with. And there are people who have vehemently opposed this game. And for today's critical thought, I want to talk about the marketing perception of a game and how the game that you're making may not align with the marketing that you're doing, and why that can come back to bite you, even if your game is not that bad. Last year, with the release of the Callisto Protocol, when it came out, it got a lot of negative reviews, especially from hardcore horror, survival horror, and action horror channels. There was one person who I was watching their review of the game, and they were sounding like legitimately angry at this game as to why they didn't like it, and all the things they hated, and why Signalis was better. And it was actually the impetus for me to make my piece last year about what does it mean to analyze game design as opposed to just simply reviewing it. And this is not the first rodeo that we've seen when it comes to how a game can just come out and fumble in terms of consumer expectations and consumer perception. For that, we can go back to 2004 with Doom 3. When Doom 3 came out, it was hated. I mean, seriously hated by a lot of publications, a lot of reviewers. There were YouTube videos about how id Software was dying, and Twitch streamers were bemoaning that, Western first-person shooters were dying, and this is the end of the genre, and id Software should just disappear, and wait. Oh, I'm sorry, my invisible earpiece is telling me that didn't happen because YouTube and Twitch weren't around in 2004, in that magical before time. But the point is that when Doom 3 came out, it was not viewed well. It was not reviewed well, people hated it. It was seen as just this massive betrayal of the brand. So while I was looking at impressions of the Callisto Protocol, people, surprisingly enough, have been still talking about Doom 3. They've been talking about it for the last few years. And it's led to me to have this realization about the two games. Doom 3 is to first-person shooters as the Callisto Protocol is to action horror. And that simply is that they're not. But the market tried to wield these games into their respective genres, and it did not work out well, at least during that time. Now, here's a very interesting factoid. When Doom was first released way back in the 90s, it was considered to be a horror game. In interviews and in retrospective pieces, both John Romero and John Carmack talked about how the original concept for Doom was supposed to be this very scary game. I mean, I even brought this up in my book about horror design, where I discussed the power fantasy. And again, if we look at the basic explanation of the original Doom, it sounds like a horror game. You are the sole survivor after everyone around you has been murdered by demons. You are trapped on another planet, and it's only up to you to figure out how to get out and survive. I mean, if I had some ominous lighting and music right now, that sounds like a horror movie to me. But as we know, that kind of faded away the second we started moving, and again, we picked up the shotgun. Imagine someone trying to write a review or a piece about Doom Eternal complaining about that it feels too much like a horror game, and there's monsters, so it's supposed to be scary. And again, what we saw with Doom, and as Doom franchise or the franchise from id, it became more about the power fantasy. Rip and tear until it is done. Insert Mick Gordon music right here. And any deviation from that marketing perception or the consumer expectation is oftentimes met with frustration or hostility. And Doom 3 and the Callisto Protocol are not the only examples of this. During the late 80s through to the 90s, As major franchises had their first sequels, we saw developers try to do very interesting things with them. Super Mario Bros. 2, of course, our Super Mario Bros. 2 in the United States, was based or was lifted from another game. Castlevania 2 became more of an open world, just confusing mix of puzzles. There was, of course, Zelda 2 being an action RPG, and there are other examples of this. But when we saw Doom 3 and then to the Callisto Protocol, this was a case where the market was expecting one thing, and what developers were pitching and what was being shown was something else. When we had initial trailers and footage of Doom 3, the main thing that was being showed was the id Tech. It was about the dynamic lighting and the effects and watching enemies get killed and gibs and jibs and all that all over the place. With the Callisto Protocol, this was a game that we saw a man who looks eerily like Josh Duhamel being killed by monsters, and it's dark and it's spooky, and who knows when somebody's going to come out and get you. And these elements create expectations. What we got, however, were games that were very different. And this is where we have this issue when it comes to marketing, and even trying to understand the game you are trying to make and what the consumer is expecting out of it. As we've said before in previous topics about marketing and trailers and so on, how you describe your game, how you show off your game, is what gives it that perception. If you tell someone, hey, my game is like Dead Cells meets The Binding of Isaac meets Slay the Spire, well, I'm going to be assuming your game is going to be built around those three similar systems, or those gameplay loops. If you try to make a game and say that it's a JRPG, but it plays and looks like a first-person shooter, people are going to be obviously upset with you. And when Doom 3 came out, it felt like no one really knew what to do with the game at the time. And there is a very proof-positive example of how the marketing and the developers' development didn't quite mesh up. And I can explain to you in 2 words. Duct tape. When Doom 3 was kind of re-released as the Everything Altogether edition, they integrated the duct tape mod to the game, and the duct tape mod at the time was one of the most popular options for that game. It allowed you to attach your flashlight to your gun, thereby removing the need to lift up your flashlight, lift up your gun, and the two can never meet. And you see, this right here is the major problem that Doom 3 had in terms of the marketing perception. When we play survival horror games, we're expected to have limitations, to be weak, to have something to have to overcome or compensate for. We've seen this with the Amnesia games, with Outlast, FNAF. Any horror or action horror game imaginable has these limitations. But when people think of Doom, they didn't think of horror. They didn't think of the player being weak or scared. They think, pick up shotgun, bad guy, boom, reload, that sweet reload sound and animation. And when you portray that, it comes off as, a massive issue to the consumer. It's why some of these games that once that consumer mindset sets in, that's it. Like, no one will touch that game with a 10-foot pole. And with Doom 3, again, it took many years. I didn't start hearing people praising this game for what it did until maybe 2019, 2020, thereabout. And even then, some people still mod the game to change some of the aspects of the weapons. But you see, this is the problem, or this is what we had that issue with. Doom 3 was not really built to be a survival horror game, or at least it wasn't built to embody those elements, because that's what its franchise was not known for. It was known to be a first-person shooter. If you wanted to make that a survival horror game or an action horror game, it had to present itself with more of those elements. It had to slow things down. The problem I think it had with its marketing perception or the consumer expectations is that it tried to fit everything that's Doom into a horror experience. But it doesn't work like that. And it's why, from a game dev point of view, if your studio is known and a master of X, that doesn't mean you can just immediately switch to a completely new genre and be 100% experts in it. And a good example of this with Doom 3 was the numerous monster closets. Again, for a game that was trying to be more horror-oriented, it got to the point where a map could be described as this. Take 3 steps forward, enemy spawns behind you, turn around and shoot them. Take another 3 steps forward, enemy spawns behind you, turn around and shoot them. Walk into a room, all of a sudden, every wall reveals to be a closet. It turns out that the whole Mars base in Doom 3 was just made up of nothing but closets that things got stuck in. And again, if it leaned more towards those elements, or if it was perceived or marketed to be more of a horror game rather than, here, watch an enemy's head perfectly disintegrate in full 3D glory, it probably would have done better at that time. Now, to take this to the Callisto Protocol. Again, when people were looking at this game, they were expecting an action horror title. Again, it is a game from a lot of the people who worked at Visceral Games, who made Dead Space, one of the more recognizable action horror franchises and one of the best ones we've had. And when you look at screenshots of it, there's a guy standing there with a diegetically enhanced suit where you can see all their vitals on it, and you're stomping on enemies and things are coming at you from the dark. But instead, what we got was a somewhat competent action game. There is a GIF that someone posted. I think this was I saw from the creator of Gloomwood, who also really likes Doom 3. And in this GIF, they showed someone who was playing this game at like the super master level. There's apparently one section in the Callisto Protocol that a lot of people who came in from a horror or survival horror genre perspective did not like. And then this person just comes along and it's like, okay, go in, heavy hit, quick shot, grab limb, throw it over there, quick shot, heavy attack, and just rips and tears through what was considered a hard encounter within 15 to 20 seconds. And for me, I was like, wow, that's really neat. I want to try this game. But I can guarantee that the developers and the marketing people may not have enjoyed that GIF all that much. Because if you're pitching a game as a spooky horror, creep around the dark, watch out, don't let anything come at you experience, and then you have someone just recreate a John Wick battle with telekinetic throws, it kind of creates that mixed messaging. And it's again why I said in my review of the Callisto Protocol that it is not a good action horror game, but it's a pretty good action game. It feels good to fight these enemies. But again, that's not how the game was pitched. That's not how, when people were picking this game up and looking at the store page, they weren't trying to play this as the next Doom Eternal or any kind of hardcore shooter. They want something that was slowed down, that was spooky, that you weren't supposed to fight every single enemy. In this game, however, you're going to fight every single enemy or stealth kill or fling kill or environmental kill them to Kingdom Come. And it's going to be very interesting and telling to see in 5-10 years from now, when people rediscover the Callisto Protocol, what are they going to think about that now that the marketing hype, the YouTuber, Twitch ecosphere has moved on? And what does it mean to just play that game right then and there? Because there have been games that have had not the best launches for one reason or another, but became cult classics many years after the fact. And we're kind of seeing that with Doom 3. And while I don't think we're going to see a Doom Eternal 2 that's going to go the Doom 3 route, maybe someone will be inspired by it and try to make their own horror shooty experience. To wrap up our video for today, marketing matters when it comes to your games, and it matters when it comes to explaining to someone what they should expect out of your title. If your trailers and store page tells one story and your game tells another, people are going to obviously assume that you are trying to rip them off. And it's why studying genre qualifiers and elements of genres is very important as a designer. If you tell me to expect really great platforming and RPG combat, and your platforming is horrible to play, again, I'm not going to care about your RPG design, I'm not going to care about your story or aesthetics. I'm going to be annoyed that my platforming is terrible and frustrating to play. And again, this is where these risks come in, especially when you're moving or trying to take a franchise in a new direction. And for a lot of developers, it's oftentimes better to make spin-off games. We saw this with everything from all the Mario games, tennis, doctoring. I think, is there a Mario Teaches Typing? I don't even remember. Maybe I just made that one up. When we see this with the various Shin Megami Tensei spin-offs, and many more examples along these lines, that when you spin off a franchise, it lets you get creative and weird with it in a way that doesn't upset the main entry. If Doom 3 would have been called anything else other than Doom 3, there's a good chance it may have been viewed a lot more favorably. But like I said, if you're naming something as the next mainline entry in a franchise, and it does not deliver what people expect out of that franchise, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle with 2 arrows in your knees already. Sometimes you can recoup from that, but in a lot of cases, it is just an unnecessary headache and frustration that you don't need. So remember, for developers watching, once you've settled on your core gameplay loop, the kind of market you're aiming for, you want all marketing and press around your game to be geared and centered towards that. If you're building a hardcore racing game, you probably don't want to advertise this on JRPG groups or turn-based combat fans. So for those of you watching, can you think of other examples of games where the marketing and the game itself were just completely at odds with one another? Let me know in the comments down below. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to do the YouTubing stuff people tell you to do. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, check out my books wherever they are sold. Visit our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games.